In the shadowy corridors of ancient religious history, a provocative mystery unfolds. One that challenges the very nature of divinity as presented in today's mainstream Judeo-Christian beliefs. What if the God of the Bible, often thought of as an omnipresent spirit without form, actually had a body? This startling concept is not as far-fetched as it might seem. Like the deities of Egypt, Akkad, Ugarit, and Phoenicia, the biblical figures El and Yahweh were once envisioned in a form astonishingly human. Imagine a deity not bound by ethereal abstraction, but one who speaks.
God said, "Let there be light."
Walks and interacts with the physical world. A God who breathes life into clay to create mankind. Who debates with Abraham and who meets Moses face to face. This was a God who wasn't just an omnipotent force, but a being with a personal story, familial ties, and a vivid presence among his followers. But a pivotal shift occurred, a transformation so profound that it redefined the essence of this divine figure, which led to the evolution of the incorporeal, mysterious deity worshipped today. Why did ancient Israelites, who once depicted their God in tangible, relatable forms, suddenly enforce a prohibition against such images? The commandment, "You shall not make for yourself a carved image," marks a significant theological evolution from a visible to a hidden God, which eventually became an invisible one. This documentary will delve into the fascinating journey how the God of the Bible, once physically depicted and actively participating in human affairs, transcended into the abstract, unseen deity of modern faith. We will explore ancient texts, archaeological discoveries, and theological debates that unveil this enigmatic transformation. Was the hiddenness of God a deliberate theological advancement or response to evolving religious and social landscapes? Uncover the profound implications of these questions in a quest that not only revisits the forgotten physicality of Yahweh, but also challenges the very foundation of how we perceive the divine. Get ready to uncover the lost body of God, a journey that will redefine the boundaries of faith and history. Recovering God's body. If you really want to trigger people, and I mean seriously upset some, talk about the obvious appearances of God in the Bible having a physical body similar to Mesopotamian deities like Shamash, Egyptian gods like Amun-Re, Hittite deities, Ugaritic gods like El. That god's name sounds familiar. Talk about this male god having battle-ready hands, strong and sturdy feet, sitting on an actual massive heavenly throne, a mighty warrior's voice, a beautiful masculine face, with a glowing beard, piercing fierce eyes, with organs that feel all the emotions we do, but on a heightened scale. A powerful penis, used to produce godly offspring with his consort Asherah, and you will have swarms of devout fundamentalists with theological towers of Babel, built with their real daddy Plato's philosophy, forcing them to speak one language. Take my word, my last documentary on the real God of the Bible, highlighting Francesca Stavrakopoulou's book, God and Anatomy, really brought out the best in zealous Bible believers. I'm being sarcastic. Seriously though, many disgusting derogatory words flew out of many online apologists' mouths, suggesting this as anti-Semitic. No, apologist. This is anti-theology in all its glory. We are not only going to show you God's body in all its anthropomorphic splendor, but we're coming to the defense of Francesca Stavrakopoulou from sensitive fundies grossed out that God is portrayed in their sacred texts in ways they prefer to ignore or close their eyes and shout, "Be gone in the name of Jesus!" We will bring several academics with similar observations to the table on this matter to show you this God. They would prefer us pretend that this God is so alien to all other deities from all other cultures, even the ones in Ugarit, who literally have the same God El as their chief deity. I'll take 1,000 for Israelites or Canaanites. It's my duty to come to the defense of serious academia on this matter, because we want the facts. We want the truth, even if some can't handle the truth.
You want answers?
I think I'm entitled.
You want answers?
I want the truth!
You can't handle the truth!
Just maybe this wake-up call of a documentary will help people understand why scholars see God in the Bible as being so human-like as all other gods in these regions. This idea of God having a body, head, feet, arms, penis, wife and all, is not a fringe idea among scholars of the Hebrew Bible. Some have cried woe to some of Dr. Stavrakopoulou's interpretations of God, like in Isaiah 6. She suggests that the text is describing God's enormous phallus filling the temple. These triggered cries from online would have you believe she is defeated because some other scholar may disagree or not be completely on board with this particular interpretation. Far from it. May I remind you, the gods of all surrounding cultures, including the culture from which the Israelites and Judeans arose, have gods performing sexual acts all the time. The problem isn't with pointing out the obvious in these ancient texts. It's with us, and our sensitivities from being willing to admit they are there, and this God isn't off limits either. We will share other voices from serious scholars in the field along the way. If you'd like to dive deeper into this project, you might find the work of Dr. Andreas Wagner, along with Dr. Esther J. Hamori, Dr. Benjamin D. Sommer, and Dr. Christoph Marskis. Very useful as a foundation for this project. For a long time, nobody wanted to see and observe the anthropomorphic facts found in the Old Testament, but they are simply too numerous and too obvious to be overlooked. The Old Testament texts outline an anthropomorphic body image of God. We have to understand that in the Old Testament, the prohibition of images meant the prohibition of statues, not the prohibition of ideas about the image and body of God. Chapter 2. We also have those who cheer us on from the crowds, because they too are on a pursuit of truth and discovery of facts. They see through the theological blanket covering God's body from visibility. This video is dedicated to you, my friends, and those sincerely journeying to understand the context of the biblical portrait of God. For every picture in the Bible that makes God look and act like humans, there is a theological trick to get out of this pickle. Does God repent? Yes and no. And the Lord was sorry that he made man on the earth, and he was grieved in his heart. Genesis 6:8. And God is not a man that he should lie, neither the Son of Man that he should repent. Hath he said, and shall he not do it? Or hath he spoken, and shall he not make it good? Numbers 23:19. Does God know all things? Yes and no. For whenever our heart condemns us, God is greater than our heart, and he knows everything. 1 John 3:20. And, but the Lord God called to the man, Where are you? Genesis 3:9. Did Moses see God face to face? Yes and no. Moses saw God, but not just his back parts. The Lord would speak to Moses face to face, as one speaks to a friend. Exodus 33:11. However, Jesus says, no one has seen God but him. No one has ever seen God but the one and only Son, who is himself God and is in closest relationship with the Father, has made him known. John 1:18. In the introduction of Dr. Sommer's book, The Bodies of God, he starts off with a bang. The God of the Hebrew Bible has a body. This must be stated at the outset, because so many people, including many scholars, assume otherwise. The evidence for this simple thesis is overwhelming, so much so that asserting the carnal nature of the biblical God should not occasion surprise. What I propose to show in this book is that the startling or bizarre idea in the Hebrew Bible is sometimes else entirely not that God has a body, that is the standard notion of ancient Israelite theology, but rather that God has many bodies located in sundry places in the world that God created. One need not go very far into the Bible to find a reference to God's form or shape. Both terms, in fact, appear in the 26th verse of the Bible, in which God addresses various unnamed heavenly creatures as follows: Let us make humanity in our form, according to our shape, so that they rule over the fish of the sea, and the birds in the sky, and the beast over all the earth, and all the creeping things that creep on the earth. Genesis 1:26. This verse begins from the assumption that God and the unnamed heavenly creatures have bodies, and it tells us that human bodies will have the same basic shape as theirs. Because this verse plays an important role in chapter 3 of this book, I do not address it at length here. Suffice it to say that the verse makes clear that human and divine bodies have the same contours, but it does not say anything about what the respective bodies are made of. Is it made of some type of material? Is it distinctly made of light, which is why it needed to be surrounded by dark clouds in some contexts? Seems Dr. Sommer is on the right track about different types of bodies of God, and how this idea seems to change over time, even within the Bible. But one thing is for sure, God never stops having an actual body, until later philosophy spoils the fun. We have clear text which suggests God had a form in a material, physical sense, while other times it points to a non-material anthropomorphism. And after a powerful introduction showing God in very detailed descriptive ways as being at certain places at certain times with what appears to be an actual body, Dr. Sommer makes a jab at the field. To these examples, one could add copious evidence from narrative, prophecy, and Psalms, many of which are examined in detail in chapter 2 and 3. In light of these texts, it is surprising that many scholars ignore or even deny the corporeality of the biblical God. Others acknowledge the evidence, but attempt to minimize it or to claim that it is to be understood only symbolically. This may be one of the reasons he felt it necessary to write his book, I strongly suggest you pick up a copy of this work. To tease you of the backing of the process done by Dr. Stavrakopoulou's book, From Dr. Sommer, listen to what he has to say and tell me it doesn't pique your interest. To achieve the first of these goals, it is necessary to place the biblical documents into their cultural, ideological, and theological contexts. When we examine biblical texts from within their own world, the world of the ancient Near East, we can notice crucial aspects of these texts that were clear to their original audiences, but seem hazy or completely invisible to our much later eyes. What I have to say about the Hebrew Bible in this book is based on models drawn from texts written by the Mesopotamian and Northwest Semitic peoples, who were the ancestors and neighbors of the ancient Israelites. Therefore, chapter 1 treats texts and artifacts from outside ancient Israel. I imagine many readers came to this book to find out what it has to say about Hebrew scripture, and some of those readers may be tempted to skip my discussion of Akkadian, Ugaritic, Phoenician, and Aramaic material in chapter 1 so they can instead go straight to the discussions of biblical texts that follow. I beg you not to do so. Nothing I say about biblical texts in chapter 2 and 3 will be convincing unless those texts are read alongside their close cousins from Babylonia, Assyria, and Canaan. What I attempt to do in this book is to recover a lost biblical theology. To find what has been lost, we need to enter a specific thought world. The door into that thought world is located in Mesopotamia, to which we now turn. He then goes on to break down divine fluidity in the cultures where the biblical traditions arose, then to the biblical deity. But one thing is for sure. We can thank the scribes we call P and E for redacting or changing certain ideas about how God interacted with his worshippers. What I'm getting at is simply, the Bible isn't one book telling one story that is univocal, one voice. Each book needs to be taken as its own author with their own agenda and ideas. Scholars have noticed ideas in these Hebrew Bible texts, which may date back to the 8th century BCE all the way down to the 2nd century BCE. This brings us back to Francesca's God and Anatomy, where she describes her experience as a child, coming across an illustrated children's Bible, having Abraham about to sacrifice his son Isaac by tying him up, ready to pierce the knife through his skin and burn him to Yahweh, thanks to the angel for stopping it. She recalls an old man carrying 2 stone slabs with laws given by God on a mountain, as well as another old man being taken by God on a fiery chariot, moved by horses pulling it, ascending to heaven. She describes Jonah tangled up with seaweed inside of a giant well, and then goes on to articulate Jesus laying in a bed of hay after being born by Mary, the image of a woman dancing in front of John the Baptist's head on a shiny platter. Next up was Jesus on a big wooden cross, beaten and bloody. And while she never believed in God, she seemed to always have been fascinated by religion, and family trips to museums really made these ancient religions tangible. She says, giant stone statues of gods, rounded, fleshy, and powerful. Gods draped in tunics and wearing sandals. Gods with toenails, elbows, eyebrows. In other rooms, there were brightly painted coffins with bodies wrapped in strips of dirty fabric, surrounded by gods with the faces of animals. A cat, a dog, a bird, a crocodile. Turn a corner and there were more gods, this time carved on tiny polished stones, sitting on thrones in long skirts, with horns on their crowns and monsters at their feet. In museums, I learned that the deities of Egypt, Mesopotamia, Greece, and Rome were the gods of the wider world in which the Bible was made. But where were the statues of the God of the Bible himself, the only deity among them to survive into the modern day? Her experience in some ways was mine, because she accurately described this strange enigma from theology students who believed God doesn't have a body. God was formless, imageless, and invisible, only becoming physical in human form through Jesus on earth for a brief 33-year period, only to return to heaven out of sight. She continues, "But as I looked closely at the books comprising the Bible, I couldn't find this bodiless God. Instead, these ancient texts conjured a startling corporeal image of God as a human-shaped deity who walked and talked and wept and laughed, a God who ate and slept and felt and breathed, and a God who was distinctly male. As my undergraduate studies progressed, no one seemed to talk about the body of the biblical God. Until one memorable lecture, when the gender politics of modern Christian theology were being discussed, I was excited to discover that feminist theologians had long taken issue with the maleness of God in their scriptures. And yet, it soon transpired that the way in which both feminist and traditionalist theologians proposed getting around this sticky issue was to insist that God couldn't possibly have a sex or a gender because God didn't have a body. I vividly recall protesting in the question and answer session at the end of the lecture, but lots of biblical texts suggest that God is masculine with a male body. "The problem isn't God," replied the professor, a highly respected Christian theologian and a man of the cloth. "The problem only arises when we take the Bible's descriptions too literally." He went on to explain that those troublesome biblical portrayals of a corporeal, masculine God were simply metaphorical or poetic. "We shouldn't get too distracted by references to his body," he said. To do so, he exclaimed, was to engage too simplistically with the biblical texts. Apparently, we had to look not just at the text, but through the text to engage their theological truths. This is exactly what the theological mobs online expect us to accept. But just as Francesca wasn't appeased, neither are we. We know that there is much more being missed, and along with her words, we also think, why should I look past the clear image of God as a gigantic man with a heavy tread, weapons in his hands and breath as hot as sulfur, a God who took on monstrous sea dragons in a physical fight and won, a God who walked about in his heavenly garden and in the cemeteries of his people, a God who stripped a woman naked and offered her up to be gang mutilated, a God who sat on a throne in a temple, enjoying the aroma of scorched animal fat as he waited for his dinner, a God who not only had children, but who willingly and willfully offered up his beloved son to be killed as a sacrifice. How could I not be distracted? Here was a deity just like those I'd visited in museums as a child, a God of ancient myths, fantastic stories, and long-lost rituals, a God from the distant past, from a society utterly unlike our own. Those were the terms on which I wanted to encounter him, not as a distant and abstract being, but as the product of a particular culture at a particular time, made in the image of the people who lived then, a God shaped by their own physical circumstances, their own view of the world, and their own imaginations. We want to resurrect this fossil of a God we find in the Bible to analyze him for what he actually looks like. It's a fascinating thing to observe how believers have theorized this deity away over time with heightened abstract philosophical attributes. Even critics of Christianity and the faithful are trapped, arguing this theoretical perception of God, instead of going to the clear ink of the texts throughout the Bible describing God very human-like, as if some revelation occurred, Francesca says, and then it suddenly dawned on me. Everyone else in the room, my theology professor included, was censoring the Bible, sanitizing its deity of any mythological, earthly, or unsettling characteristics. I was disappointed by them, and disappointed for them. This is the book I'd have liked to read when I was at university. It tells the story of the real God of the Bible in all his corporeal, uncensored, scandalous forms, stripping away the theological veneer of centuries of Jewish and Christian piety. This book disentangles the biblical God from his scriptural and doctrinal fetters to reveal a deity wholly unlike the God worshipped by Jews and Christians today. The God revealed in this book is the deity as his ancient worshippers saw him, a supersized, muscle-bound, good-looking God with suprahuman powers, earthly passions, and a penchant for the fantastic and the monstrous. The body is the same for humans as for God. How do we unlearn the layers of dogma in order to see God in his ancient Near Eastern context, rather than endlessly playing philosophical and theological gymnastics? My own experience tells me that it is going to take each person to give these ideas a chance. The best thing we can do is listen to the observations, consider whether we made God into our own theological and philosophical image, and try to see how everyone else viewed their deities in the world God grew up in. It's actually unfortunate that theology has muddied the waters for researching the God of the Bible in its original context. Thanks to Hellenism, coupled by the Greek philosophers, Jewish and Christian sensitivities to images of God was heightened. In effect, over time, this made an entirely new version of God, which is completely foreign to the Old Testament. We desire to start fresh, without theological anachronisms telling us being made in the image of God doesn't actually mean humans look like God and God looks like humans in a visual form. The biblical text will paint a verbal picture for us. All we have to do is try to visualize what it describes. Often the language describing this God has so much overlap with other ancient Near Eastern examples, it becomes necessary to bring those up just to show you very clear ways to situate what the Bible appears to be saying and visualizing for us. The evidence isn't limited to verbal images in text. We can also look to material images such as drawings and statue depictions, as Dr. Andreas Wagner suggests in their book, God's Body. We will rely heavily on that book throughout this documentary. Material images reveal clearly how the external form was seen in the ancient Orient and in Old Testament times. Thus, they are particularly suitable as source material for the concept of the figure and for understanding the depicted body. The characteristics of material depictions converge well with those verbal images. While we have limited material images for this God, we do have some. We can also see how particular culture views the figure and body, which will help us see the perception of the human figure of God. Simply put, the ancient believed man was made in the image of God. One could technically learn what the cultural understanding of man is, then imagine God reflects their perception. In a gist, this is what Dr. Wagner suggests. A. Understanding ancient art and images from the Old Testament era requires diving into their unique visual culture, which differs significantly from ours. We need to appreciate how people in the past viewed images, which can be quite different from how we see them today. In our world, We're bombarded daily with countless images from TV, movies, ads, and art, all presented on flat surfaces like screens and paper. This overload influences our perception, yet we rarely think about how we've learned to interpret these two-dimensional images as three-dimensional ideas in our minds. It's important to recognize that not all images require complex thought to understand, as some are designed to simply evoke emotional responses. We should avoid overly criticizing images or comparing them unfavorably to the written word, as images by themselves do not threaten rational thinking. Understanding images from ancient cultures like the ancient Orient takes effort and openness to their unique visual language. B. The way humans and their bodies are perceived changes across different cultures and times. Modern historical anthropology explores how body depictions serve as a form of communication in ancient cultures, including the ancient Orient and the Old Testament. These historical perceptions can be very different from today's views and deeply influence traditional beliefs about human forms. To understand old representations of human forms, like those in the Old Testament, we must set aside our modern biases and learn from the historical context of those times. Misunderstandings can arise if we don't adjust our approach to accommodate those cultural differences. I think most people know the famous commandment to avoid creating idols. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make any persisted idol, and no likeness of things in heaven above, on earth below, or what is in the water under the earth. Do not bow down to them, to worship them, and do not serve them. For I am Yahweh, your God, am a jealous God, who visits the sins of the fathers on the children, to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me, but who is faithful to thousands who love me and keep my commandments. The pesel refers to an ancient sculpted figure, often made with precious metals by goldsmiths. These small idols, from the late Bronze Age to the Iron Age in the region of Israel-Palestine, usually stand no taller than 15 centimeters, though some larger pieces have been found. Great care was given to carving the idol's face and hands, likely because these features were thought to connect with the divine. The eyes were especially realistic, and the use of gold or silver gave the figures a godly glow. The positions of these statues were meaningful. A god could be shown sitting or standing, often on a base, and their stance might express power or welcome. Their outfits were diverse, sometimes including crowns or shoes, and occasionally jewelry like earrings to draw attention to certain areas, adding to their grandeur. We can find many material images of the gods in very descriptive way that match the verbal descriptions of them in the literature, but a lurking scholarly question remains about which idols are absolutely forbidden, idols of Yahweh or idols of foreign gods. Two explanations have scholarly attention. One theory suggests that originally Yahweh worship did not include images, which is why they were forbidden. Any animal images found, like the golden calf in Exodus, are exceptions and not well understood. This rule also became stricter over time because of the rejection of foreign gods. Or two, another view holds that the ban on images developed later, particularly during and after the Babylonian exile, when the Israelites were away from their temple. This period made them rely less on physical images for worship and think of their God in new, non-physical ways. The influence of foreign gods also played a role in shaping this rule. This is the position Francesca Stavrakopoulou argues, and it makes a lot of sense. Why ban an idea if it isn't something happening already? Whatever the case actually is, the strict thrust towards not making images in Yahweh religion became a foundational component. This Babylonian exilic or post-exilic text in the Decalogue may have been influenced by Persian religion, and if one dates this material into the Hellenistic period, one can see Plato and the philosophers' condemnation of idols as a growing trend, because the true God cannot be made into an image. As Francesca has pointed out in her book about Xenophanes, talking about horses making gods in their image, cattle making gods into their image, the point for these philosophers was God had no image. God was imageless. We even have the Greek philosopher Heraclitus in ancient Persian-controlled Ephesus during the 6th century BCE, seemingly echoing a condemnation of idol worship. This philosopher is saying this around the same time that Persia controlled Judeans. They raised their voices at stone idols, as a man might argue with his doorpost. They have understood so little of the gods. This really isn't an outlandish idea, especially in light of the syncretism of Zoroastrian thought with Greek thinkers. Some scholars have suggested Heraclitus' thought about fire may have inspiration from Zoroastrianism. Many of the doctrines of Zoroastrian fire do not match exactly with those of Heraclitus, such as the relation of fire to earth, but he may have taken some inspiration from them. This is from Martin L. West, 1971. We find heavy discouragement of idol worship even in Zoroastrian Avesta. You could see in verse 10, "But you despise the good and poor, and worthy and travelers. You also disregarded God, and you worshipped idols, and practiced evil thoughts and evil words and evil deeds." So in reality, what caused the imageless worship of Yahweh? Was it simply being too far away from home and not having the images with them? Was there a shift in the religious environment of Persia and Greek thinkers to depict God without image? Who knows exactly what the case is, but I love exploring the various paths. I want to highlight what Francesca says in her book. The biblical ban on divine images is often held to signal the incorporeal nature of God, marking him out as a deity distinct from any other in the ancient world, a deity impossible to craft in clay or metal, wood or stone, by virtue of being bodiless. But the Bible's promotion of imageless worship indicates no such thing. The cults of various Egyptian, Assyrian, Babylonian, and Phoenician deities all experienced periods of aniconic worship, despite the fact that these deities were understood to have bodies. The prohibition of divine images in the Ten Commandments points instead to a growing emphasis on the hiddenness of God's body, as a closely related tradition in Deuteronomy indicates. Depicting God and man. Sometimes visuals help aid us in seeing what's in the biblical texts. So I've decided to share 3 images from Dr. Wagner's book, God's Body, to really nail the verbal visualization of God compared to man, organized with each body part on the far left. The examples that could be given are massive, and this literally just scratches the surface. You can find several other examples all throughout Dr. Stavrakopoulou's book, God and Anatomy. We're looking at Table 2.1, matching of exemplary biblical references for the comparison of bodily forms of God and man, respectively. On the body part section, you're looking at head, and we're starting with bodily form, external verbal image of God. Then we'll move right. Isaiah 59:17, He, Yahweh, put on righteousness as his breastplate, and set the helmet of salvation on his head, and put on the garments of revenge, and attired himself with zeal as with a cloak. For the man, Numbers 6:5, as long as his vow lasts, no razor shall be used on his head. He is holy until the time he has vowed himself to Yahweh has passed, and he must allow the hair on his head to grow long. They're talking about head, the person's head. You've got the man's head. Nobody doubts the man has a head. You get to God, it's talking about God's head. Well, the authors thought God had an actual head, a bodily head. These aren't metaphors. If they're metaphor for God, they're metaphor for man. Apply that logic to every body part described throughout this video and anytime you open up your Bible. Psalm 60 verse 9, God has spoken in his sanctuary. Gilead is mine, Manasseh is mine, Ephraim is the safeguard on my head, Judah is my scepter. Zechariah 6:11, take silver and gold from them and make crowns and crown the head of Joshua, the high priest, the son of Jehozadak. You will notice as the documentary continues, sometimes the language is used in a metaphorical way, but even in the metaphor, it is implied there is a real physical, actual, attributable body behind the usage of this language that needs to be real, or else the metaphor falls apart. Face or countenance, Genesis 33:10. Jacob answered, no, please. If I have found favor in your eyes, accept the gift from my hands, for I saw your face, as if I saw God's countenance, and you were gracious to me. Of course, there's Job as well, Amos, Genesis 6:8, but Noah found favor in the eyes of Yahweh. And then you go to the right with man, Genesis 43:31. And after he, Joseph, had cried, had washed his face, he went out and controlled himself and said, serve the food. 2 Samuel 19:5. But the king covered his face and cried aloud, O my son Absalom, Absalom, my son, my son. Goes on talking about eyes and sight in their face. Continuing into the next page of table 2.1, ear, 2 Kings 19:16. Hezekiah says, Yahweh, give ear and hear. Open your eyes and see and hear the words Sennacherib has sent to insult the living God. Let's look at the man's side. Exodus 32:2. Aaron spoke to them, take off the golden earrings on the ears of your wives, your sons and your daughters, and bring them to me. I just want to make a note. How many times believers say God hears their prayers? And do they think God actually hears their prayers? Or is this spirit not actually listening because it doesn't have ears? Oh no, it's way beyond our comprehension. And this is just little anthropomorphized language for us to understand. Nose, 2 Samuel 22:9. Smoke rose from his nostrils, nose, and consuming fire from his mouth. Flames came from him. Genesis 2:7 with man. And Yahweh God formed man out of the earth from the field and blew the breath of life into his nostrils, nose, and man became a living soul. Let's go down to mouth. Leviticus 24:12. And took him, a blaspheming Israelite, prisoner, until they received a clear answer from the mouth of Yahweh. Judges 7:6. The number of men who lapped was 300. All the rest of the people drank kneeling from the hand to the mouth. Go to throat, neck. Jeremiah 6:8. Mend your ways, Jerusalem, before I turn my neck from you and make you a desolate country in which no one lives. Psalm 69:2. God help me, for the water has come up to my neck. Third page, table 2.1. Arm, Exodus 15:16. Terror and dread fell upon them. They froze like stones in the face of your powerful arm until the people passed by who you purchased. On the man's side, Psalm 18:35. He teaches my hands to fight and my arm to bend the bronze bow. Right hand, Isaiah 62:8. Yahweh has sworn by his right hand and by his mighty arm. Genesis 48:13. Then Joseph took them both, Ephraim on his right hand toward Israel's left hand, and Manasseh by his left hand toward Israel's right hand, and brought them to him. Sounds pretty actual as a body. Hand, Jeremiah 18:6. Can I not treat you from the house of Israel, as this potter does? Yahweh declares, look like clay in the hand of the potter, so are you in my hand, O house of Israel. Proverbs 26:15 with the man's side, the sluggard buries his hand in the dish, and he is too lazy to bring it to his mouth. And then foot. 2 Samuel 22:10, he, Yahweh, bowed the heavens and came down, and darkness was under his feet. Genesis 18:4, let a little water be brought to wash your feet, and take a seat under this tree. It's odd that we look at one side and say metaphor and play off the language as if it's not actually talking about those objects, and then we get to the man side and it's the same kind of language, and then we take that not as metaphor. Well, we should start being more consistent. And it's not hard to piece together an idea of what God or humans looked like based on descriptions found in ancient texts. These descriptions show clear similarities. In simple terms, the same language describing actual bodies of the humans in these texts also applies to God. This is true for the literature as well as carved images we will see in a bit. But I want to make one note. There are euphemisms sometimes in these bodily objects that can mean other things. Francesca Stavrakopoulou covers that in her book, God and Anatomy. We don't dwell on that much in this version of the documentary. The other documentary, we do. Wrestling with God's Body. Let's take a fascinating journey through how the Bible talks about God looking and acting like a human, and how these ideas have evolved over time by various theologians. In the Old Testament, the big no-no was creating physical images of God or other deities, like statues. The problem wasn't with the idea that God could look like a human. The issue was when people turned these images into idols, objects of worship. This distinction is crucial because the Bible itself often describes God in human terms, showing emotions, making decisions, even taking physical form. This human-like description of God isn't just an old biblical style, something theologians have grappled with for centuries. For instance, philosophers like Martin Heidegger have explored how our language shapes our understanding of God as having human traits. When Christianity came along, the plot thickened with Jesus Christ, who Christians believe is God in human form. Suddenly, the depiction of God wasn't just permissible, it became essential to understanding the Christian faith. This was a significant shift from earlier times when any physical depiction of God could be controversial. Fast forward to the theologians like Philo of Alexandria, we see a shift again. They started to describe God in more abstract terms, beyond physical and emotional human traits. They argued that God is beyond our full understanding. We should be happy just knowing God exists, without trying to pin down an exact image or likeness. Yet, despite this abstract turn, the idea that we're made in God's image remained powerful. It suggests that even if we can't fully grasp what God is like, we can still see reflections of God's nature through the good things in life, kind of like how gifts remind us of the giver. Rather than the literal description of things being what they are in these ancient texts, the interpreter, being many church fathers, started to suggest the true meaning was the revelation of the concept or idea. So while the Old Testament cautioned against making God into an idol, over time, the focus shifted from what God isn't to be celebrating how God interacts with the world and us. It's a story of how our view of the divine has evolved from statues to subtleties, from concrete images to complex ideas. Under the sway of Logos theology, which emphasizes a more abstract understanding of God, the Christian tradition initially continued to steer clear of portraying God with human traits. This approach got a significant boost from Augustine in the 4th century. He coined the term Anthropomorphites to describe a group called the Audians. That term is related to the word audio, criticizing them for picturing God as just another human being, subject to human weaknesses and limitations. Augustine's critique hinged on a deeper thread in Christian thought, one that could always pull from Greek philosophy to argue against imagining the divine in human form. A striking illustration from this Greek vein is offered by Xenophanes, a philosopher from ancient Asia Minor. With a touch of wit, he imagined that if animals could create art, they would depict gods that looked like themselves, horses as horse-like gods, oxen as ox-like gods. This idea cleverly highlights the absurdity of crafting deities in our image. The early church debates didn't solve these issues, but laid the groundwork for ongoing tension between biblical descriptions of God and the philosophical urge to transcend these anthropomorphic instincts. This tension is vivid in the discussions of theologians who later argued that biblical language humanizing godlike attributing emotions and physical parts to the divine was not literally true, but metaphorical, meant to make the divine comprehensible to human minds. In modern times, thinkers like Rudolf Bultmann have argued that these human-like descriptions of God belong to mythic language of the past and should be reinterpreted in light of contemporary knowledge and philosophical sophistication. This ongoing dialogue shows how biblical language interacts and often clashes with evolving theological ideas, creating a dynamic and ever-changing landscape of belief. The debate over anthropomorphism, the depiction of God with human traits, isn't just a theoretical issue. It has serious implications for how we perceive the divine. One of the main concerns is that by imagining God in human terms, we risk diminishing the true nature of God's divinity and self-existence, aseity. The argument goes like this. If humans are created in God's image, and we then depict God as having human qualities, such as walking through Eden in the evening, speaking, displaying emotions like anger or jealousy, or even changing his mind, then we must ask, does this make God too human? Does it reduce the divine to the mundane? Critics worry that this is not just a simple portrayal, but a profound misunderstanding, a kind of projection where humans reshape God into a familiar, more comprehensible form, effectively creating God in our own image rather than recognizing our creation in his. These concerns are echoed not just in specialized theological debates, but also in broader interpretations of the Old Testament. There, scholars strive not just to recognize instances of anthropomorphism, but to understand them in a way that preserves the majesty and mystery of the divine. This endeavor involves balancing the accessible, relatable descriptions of God with the profound otherness and transcendence that theology asserts God embodies. The Babel-Bible dispute, sparked by Friedrich Delitzsch's provocative lecture Babel and Bible in 1902, stirred significant debate regarding the authority and interpretation of the Bible. Delitzsch used newly discovered pre-biblical Akkadian text from Babylon to challenge the uniqueness and authority of the Old Testament. He argued that many aspects of the Old Testament, including its anthropomorphic descriptions of God, were remnants of a less sophisticated stage of human development, similar to early human beliefs and practices found in other ancient cultures. Delitzsch's view reflect a common 19th century belief in cultural evolution, where societies and their religious beliefs were thought to progress from primitive to advanced stages. He considered anthropomorphism, depicting God with human traits and emotions, as a naive early stage that should be transcended by a more enlightened understanding of the divine. This perspective aligns with the thoughts of Ludwig Feuerbach, who in his 1841 work, The Essence of Christianity, argued more radically that God is essentially a projection of human qualities, purified and idealized. According to Feuerbach, religious beliefs reflect human attributes and ideals rather than any external divine reality. E. Sellen later tackled the anthropomorphism issue by suggesting that such depictions of God were merely an early form of divine revelation, suitable for the spiritual and intellectual maturity of the times, but later surpassed within the Old Testament narrative itself. He posited that as the Israelites' understanding evolved, so did their concept of God, moving from a tangible human-like form to a more abstract and transcendent entity. This notion of accommodation implies that God revealed himself in ways that were comprehensible at different stages of human development. However, this interpretation is not without its problems. It risks diminishing the relevance and spiritual insights of earlier biblical texts by labeling them as primitive or outdated. Moreover, it raises questions about the validity of viewing spiritual evolution as a linear progression, where later stages are necessarily superior to earlier ones. Such a view might overlook the possibility that each era, with its unique perspectives and insights, has an immediate and profound experience of the divine, valuable on its own terms. One could continue this argument by suggesting that the later scripture, which is now considered old and dated like the New Testament, well, that needs an updating, and in fact is also now primitive because of where we sit today. Where is the updated revelation in which we should receive that accurately reflects the divine? This problem will continue until we either are extinct or something else gives. W. Eichrodt, like E. Sellen, grapples with the challenges of anthropomorphism in biblical text, but acknowledges the necessity and potency of such descriptions. Eichrodt emphasizes that the vivid human-like depictions of God found in the Old Testament serve a crucial role. They capture the immediacy and tangible presence of the divine, attributes that might be lost under more abstract, spiritualized concepts. This immediacy, Eichrodt argues, compels the biblical authors to portray God in human forms, a necessity to express the profound sense of God's presence and interaction with humanity. Eichrodt also acknowledges the parallel tradition within the Old Testament that recognizes the limitations of such anthropomorphic descriptions. From early on, there's an awareness that seeing God as he truly is remains beyond human capability. Eichrodt identifies several layers of spiritualization in the depiction of God that move beyond direct anthropomorphism. These include the use of intermediaries like Yahweh's messenger, symbolic elements such as Yahweh's kabod or splendor, and God's countenance, and abstract concepts like the name of Yahweh. Further, he discusses the representation of God's influence through dynamic elements such as his word, spirit, and wisdom, which are accessible and recognizable even in contemporary religious thought. Eichrodt's perspective links back to early Christian theological efforts to articulate a conception of God that was both accessible and suitably transcendent, steering clear of simplistic human likenesses while maintaining a connection to human understanding. However, there is a risk in this process, as pointed out by critiques of Sellen and Eichrodt. Both scholars, in their attempt to refine the understanding of God, might lean heavily on post-biblical, logos-oriented, rational concepts of God that have dominated much of the theological history. This orientation risks imposing a later, possibly more philosophically developed perspective onto the ancient text, potentially obscuring or altering their original meaning and the way God was understood and experienced in the biblical era. Horst Dietrich Preuss, 1991, Otto Kaiser in 1998, and Rolf Rentorf, 2001, all take a stab at dealing with the anthropomorphisms. We aren't going to get into their arguments here. Various other theologians tackle the problem of anthropomorphic depictions of God in other ways, and the list goes on and on for other theologians. However, it seems all these men have something in common. They all place the biblical text into a sacred arena away from comparing it to the other divinities of all the surrounding cultures, which show obvious fingerprints on influencing the biblical authors during the creation of these materials. This special pleading really hinders them and those persuaded by their works from getting back to the ancient understanding of God as another ancient Near Eastern god. Language of images and real images. Dr. Wagner in God's Body uses examples of language which create visual representations to real-world examples for the listener or reader. The example in the book given was a tree. If I say, tree, you can see a tree in your mind's eye. But if we give more description like, a tree with a trunk which an adult can just encompass with both arms, beaten by a continual west wind to one side so that it grows at a 45-degree eternal tilt, highly branched, the annual budding shooting straight upwards. A picture of this specific tree develops in our mind's eye when we read this text. Each statement substantiates it and adds more detail. This only occurs if I can understand the language spoken. Further, the more knowledge I have of the subject in question, the easier it is. If I have never seen a tree so beaten by the wind before, then it would be harder to imagine such a tree than if I were familiar with the phenomenon. Therefore, I need linguistic and factual knowledge of the issue if I hope to understand a verbal image. Verbal images and nonverbal images are subject to the same laws and conditions, and to see how these correspond, it's important that we use the ancient Near East, which has several visuals to help us generate images for better understanding of the Hebrew Bible. Determining if texts are part of the ancient Israelite Hebrew tradition is usually straightforward. If they are written in Hebrew language and script, they likely come from an ancient Israelite community. However, classifying images as Israelite is much more complex. We don't yet have a comprehensive understanding of the art styles, techniques, and themes used during that period, so we lack a clear pictorial history of Israel. For images to be identified as Israelite, they must be found in places historically linked to ancient Israelite communities. Even then, it's challenging to confirm if an image is genuinely Israelite, because it could have been imported or made by non-Israelites in the region. First, we will focus on images accompanied by Hebrew text, targeting an Israelite audience, which helps clarify their cultural context. By examining these images, we can learn about the broader visual culture of ancient Israel and extend these findings to other images from the period. We will highlight the images from Dr. Wagner's book. This first figure highlights an 8th century BCE depiction from Katilit Adrud, where Hebrew text and imagery appear together on a pithos, indicating it was meant for an Israelite audience. I'll focus on a specific figure from this artifact to discuss the portrayal of human forms. These images, though spontaneous and not polished, like those from Egypt or Mesopotamia, share certain universal features with more refined art from those cultures, though they lack specific cultural or stylistic elements typically seen in Egyptian or Assyrian works. Instead of focusing on the artistic style or material used, this study emphasizes how human bodies and forms are depicted, regardless of whether the scene represents a procession or a group of worshippers. The depiction is straightforward, emphasizing essential elements like hair, we see hair, there's a face, a nose, a mouth, and eyes. But it omits detailed features such as individual physiognomy, age markers, or textural details of skin and muscle. Notably, the figures combine different viewpoints within the same composition. Heads are in profile, while eyes are frontal, and torsos are shown from the front, a method not unique to this site, but prevalent in works intended for a Hebrew audience. This approach is mirrored in other artifacts from the period, such as a Phoenician Israelite seal showing two humans, or human figures, likely worshippers, with similar stylistic features. The seal, possibly belonging to someone named Menachem, suggests an Israelite origin due to the names and iconography involved. The figures display a consistent artistic style, profiles with detailed hair and beards, torsos in front view, and limbs in profile. This consistent portrayal across different artifacts suggests a standardized way of depicting the human form in the cultural context. A bulla from the Burnt Archive offers a similar depiction, possibly representing a Judahite king, and a city commandment where the latter is shown in a gesture of loyalty to the king, who holds symbols of royal authority like a sword, arrow, and bow. The depiction emphasizes the king's legitimate power and the commandment's subordinate role, using a familiar artistic technique where the physical details are minimal but the symbolic content is rich. Another example from the Persian period features a sill depicting an inspector of Judah Yehud as a moon god devotee, showing the same artistic conventions of profiled heads with frontal eyes, again, and stylized postures, including a noticeable thumb detail. This persistence of style across centuries underscores the continuity and significance of these iconographic methods in ancient Near Eastern art, focusing more on symbolic representation than realistic portrayal. In the Israelite pictures we've discussed, a consistent method of depicting the human form is evident, focusing on combining various body parts in particular ways. Typically, the head in profile with the eye viewed from the front. This style diverges from more traditional artistic approaches that aim for a uniform perspective in two-dimensional art. The depictions limit themselves to essential body parts like the head, face, eye, nose, mouth, neck, torso, arms, hands, legs, and feet. Notably absent are individual details and features such as distinct facial characteristics or the intricacies of anatomy. This lack of detail could be attributed to the spontaneous nature of the artwork, such as that found at Katilat Adrud, or the limitations imposed by the small scale of sills and bulla. Comparing these depictions to more expansive and detailed works, such as the bas-reliefs found in Egypt or Assyria, might offer further insights. These larger and more detailed artworks provide a contrast that highlights the distinct artistic choices and constraints in the smaller Israelite representations. This comparison could help elucidate why the Israelite artist might have opted for such a stylized and simplified approach to depicting the human form. Take, for example, this artistic rendition of what appears to possibly be Yahweh of Samaria and Asherah. The artist depicts even the penis of the god, with the horned crown as well. These signs of individual details of each distinct body part is heightened in the language, as Francesca has pointed out in her book, Pictures from Syria, Palestine. In the exploration of corporeal depictions across various periods and regions, particularly Syria-Palestine, the fundamental principles of human representation remain largely consistent with those identified in Israelite art. These principles typically involve a profile view of the head combined with a frontal view of the eye and torso, creating a multi-perspective portrayal that contrasts with more uniform artistic traditions. Despite the core similarities, there are notable differences in iconographic programs, styles, and symbolism, influenced by diverse cultural interactions across Syria-Palestine. We will look at two images from this region. For instance, Egyptian elements are easily recognized in artifacts from regions under Egyptian influence, such as the scarab from Bet Shean, dating to the time of Ramesses II, which depicts the pharaoh in a traditional Egyptian posture, head and legs in profile, but torso frontal, emphasizing his dominance as he holds a sword. Further examples include a scarab from Megiddo, illustrating the triumph pharaoh in a similar stance, and another from Hazor, showcasing worshippers beside a crescent moon standard, indicating northern Syrian influences and symbolizing the moon god Haran. These depictions adhere to the discussed principles of corporeal representation despite their distinct cultural settings. Moreover, a scarab from Samaria features two worshippers in a unique arrangement, possibly intended to complement each other, one focusing visually and the other acoustically, although it's unclear if this was the artist's intention or a result of poor execution. The continuity of these artistic conventions extends into the Persian era, maintaining the established pattern of head in profile, eye in front, and absence of detailed features. This consistency suggests a pervasive and enduring approach to depicting the human form in the broader Syria-Palestine region, spanning from the Late Bronze Age through the Iron Ages. However, a distinct shift occurs with the introduction of Greek influence in the Phoenician area. Here, the portrayal of Hercules featured more dynamically contoured muscles, indicating a departure from the traditional profile and frontal views to a more modeled, realistic depiction of the body, aligning with Greek artistic norms. This change marks a significant divergence from the earlier, more schematic styles of the region, reflecting the profound impact of Hellenistic cultural and artistic influx. Pictures from Egypt, pictures of the Assyrians, Babylonians, and Persians. A consistent depiction of humans across Egypt, Mesopotamia, and the broader Syria-Palestine region is apparent. This persisted until the Greek Hellenistic influence brought a different artistic style. In the depicted Egyptian artworks, such as the colorful scenes of the pharaoh hunting, a scribe at work, and a household scene featuring the head of a family with his wife and son, we observe a consistent application of multi-perspectivity. Pay close attention to how Pharaoh is much larger than everyone else, because he is far more important than anyone depicted. This is also evident in the other Egyptian works of art. This artistic approach combines different views of the body parts. The torso is typically shown in frontal view, while the head is in profile, and the eyes are often depicted from the front. This method is characteristic, not just of the works from Egypt, but also appears in the artistic traditions of other ancient Near Eastern cultures. Assyria. In the Assyrian depictions, particularly those of King Assarhaddon, with his sons Assurbanipal and Assur-Shumukin, we observe a continuation of certain artistic conventions similar to those in Egypt and Syria-Palestine, yet with some notable differences that enhance the detail and naturalism of the figures. The size differentiation among the figures serves a hierarchical purpose, clearly identifying the king's superior status relative to his sons and the even smaller figures of conquered rulers, emphasizing the king's dominance and authority. This method of using scale to signify importance is a common element across various ancient cultures. The figures in Assyrian art maintain the multi-perspective approach, with legs depicted in profile and in motion, heads in profile, and eyes typically shown from the front. These characteristics align with the rest of what we've seen. However, Assyrian art also displays a greater interest in anatomical details. Unlike Egyptian figures, which often appear more stylized and less detailed, Assyrian depictions frequently include more defined muscles, knees, and ankles, giving the figure a more dynamic and naturalistic appearance. Additionally, Assyrian depictions occasionally diverge from the Egyptian preference for front-view torsos, instead presenting torsos in profile. This shift not only contributes to a sense of depth and realism, but also complements the overall dynamic poses of the figures, which are often depicted in scenes of action or conquest. Despite these details, Assyrian art, like its regional counterparts, avoids portraying individual features or expressions of sight that would suggest personal identity or emotional depth. The focus remains on idealized, typical gestures and body forms that convey power and divinity rather than personal characteristics. This treatment is evident even in scenes requiring a high level of detail, such as the depiction of a river crossing, where the backs of naked soldiers are visible. The portrayal still adheres to conventional stylizations, avoiding individuality in favor of a collective and idealized representation. Thus, while Assyrian art shares foundational principles with other ancient Near Eastern art forms, it introduces its own nuances that reflect its cultural and aesthetic priorities, emphasizing a blend of symbolic representation with a hint of naturalism that differentiates it from its Egyptian and Syrian Palestinian counterparts. You can also see these very things with the Persian procession and some of the Persian art as well. Again, very detailed in some ways, but stylistic, and it wants to give you kind of a generic feel for what the overall image is. The general depiction is similar. Babylon and Persia. In Babylonian and Persian art, the principles of corporeal representation, again, continue to align with those observed in other ancient Oriental and Israelite depictions. Despite cultural and temporal differences, the portrayal of the human form in these regions maintains a consistent approach that is conceptually oriented rather than strictly observational. Key features across cultures. The representation of the human body in these cultures does not seek to capture an optical, realistic view, but instead focuses on conveying essential and typical elements. This method, known as multi-perspectivity, involves displaying various parts of the body in their most recognizable forms: legs in stride and profile, heads in profile, with eyes often depicted frontally. This approach transcends specific cultural or chronological context and serves as a unifying artistic convention across the ancient Oriental world. Examples and principles: donkey with backpacks or pack bags. This example illustrates how artists prioritized conveying information over optical accuracy. The depiction of pack bags, one hanging correctly and the other seemingly upright, is not a mistake, but a deliberate choice to show both bags, ensuring viewers understand their presence and function. 2. Bedside scene. In another instance, the scene simplifies to the essential components of a bed to focus on its significance, especially in a symbolic or ritual context like the birth of a king. Here the bed frame is shown from above and the sideboards in profile, emphasizing the essential elements while maintaining a straightforward perspective. Artistic conventions and perspectives. The art from these regions is characterized by its frontal views, avoiding oblique angles. This style, named by H. Schaeffer, emphasizes the conceptual over the perceptual, where objects and figures are represented as they are thought to exist in a more symbolic or ideal form. Such depictions are not concerned with how things appear in reality, but rather how they are understood and recognized within cultural and religious contexts. Further extending this principle, objects like stools and pools are depicted in a way that combines various perspectives to best convey their function and essence. For example, a stool is shown with its legs in profile for stability and its seat from above to emphasize its use, while pools are depicted as geometric shapes surrounded by nature, focusing on their placement rather than their depth or the play of light and shadows. This conceptual approach to depiction differs remarkably from European traditions, especially modern ones, where the emphasis often lies on optical realism and perspective accuracy. Ancient Oriental art, including that from Babylon and Persia, uses a fundamentally different visual language. This language prioritizes symbolic meaning and functional representation over lifelike portrayal, thus offering a distinct way to understand and appreciate the artistic legacy of these ancient cultures. In the next few images, you can capture the point of how each part of the body is emphasized. The profile is not universal. Rather, eye and shoulder are depicted frontally, because this is how these parts of the body can best be seen. The Egyptian artist placed several aspects next to each other in one picture to emphasize each of them. Each is captured singly, and all parts assembled to a whole. The single parts relate to their neighbors, but not necessarily to the whole. Therefore, eye and shoulder are unhesitatingly placed in full front view within a picture of a man otherwise in profile. The same holds true for human representation in pre-Greek ancient Oriental art. Dr. Wagner does a deep dive investigating human depictions and statues as well, then moves into verbal images, comparisons, and metaphors in the language. These verbal images are in everyday speech and poetry. They bring up an image to the reader or listener that usually hits home for them to understand. If someone is using agricultural imagery, then it supposes the audience knows that world. Understanding comparisons and their cultural contexts is crucial for interpreting ancient texts accurately. For instance, in the Song of Songs, a biblical poem, different body parts like the neck, nose, and breasts are compared to towers. However, these comparisons aren't about the physical appearance as we might think today. Ancient towers were sturdy and served as fortifications, not slim and tall like modern perceptions might suggest. For example, a woman's neck is described as like the Tower of David, which at first might make us think it suggests the neck is long and slim. But in the context of the time, towers were broad and strong, indicating the metaphor likely symbolizes strength or dignity rather than shape. In no way does the woman not exist or not have a body, though, even when we use metaphorical language. Similarly, the comparison of a nose to the Tower of Lebanon doesn't imply a literal resemblance. Instead, it could suggest prominence or a distinct feature devoid of any implication about the nose's shape. The metaphor extends even to the woman's breasts, described as towers, not to suggest their shape, but their impregnability and strength, reflecting perhaps a protective or reserved nature. This approach shifts away from physical appearance to the functionality and symbolic meaning of these body parts, emphasizing traits like strength, defense, and pride rather than physical form. The poem uses these metaphors to convey deeper meanings about the subjects, using the cultural context of the time, which valued functionality and symbolic representation over mere physical description. This approach is radically different than playing theology. We are trying to understand the language and the pictures they form in our heads by seeing things through their ancient context, instead of being trapped by our modern ideas. In the Old Testament, the descriptions of body parts often carry meanings that go beyond their literal physical attributes, reflecting the cultural and linguistic context of the time. This concept is known as the functional meaning of body parts, where each part is associated with specific actions, qualities, or symbolic values rather than just its physical form. For example, when Isaiah describes the feet of a messenger who brings good news across mountains, he's not praising the physical beauty of the feet, but celebrating their role in swiftly delivering important messages. Similarly, when judges mention, "My own hand has helped me," it refers to the personal effort and strength of Israel, not just a physical hand. This functional interpretation is essential for understanding the rich, layered meanings in biblical language. The Hebrew vocabulary is relatively compact, yet it conveys a broad spectrum of nuances by focusing on the function or symbolic significance of body parts within specific contexts. This way of thinking connects the physical part of the body to a broader, more dynamic representation of human actions and attributes. Understanding this language of body parts is crucial for interpreting biblical texts accurately. It requires a deep dive into both the linguistic patterns and the cultural codes of the time. This approach is particularly important when dealing with anthropomorphic descriptions where parts of the body play a role. It should be obvious that this will aid us in linguistic depiction of the body of God. In cultural representations, both verbal and material depictions of humans often follow similar principles. highlighting how people use consistent imagery across different mediums to convey meanings and values. This concept is well illustrated in the Song of Songs, where the descriptive hymns vividly portray human figures using a selective approach to body parts, mirroring the method used in visual art we discussed earlier. In these hymns, only specific body parts are chosen to represent the whole person, emphasizing traits that are culturally significant or symbolically powerful. For example, descriptions like "your feet in sandals" and "the curves of your thighs are like jewels," or "and his eyes are like doves by the water streams," focus on parts that convey beauty, strength, or other desirable qualities. These parts are not randomly chosen. They're typical of the cultural and poetic ideals of the time, crafted to evoke specific emotions or thoughts in the audience. This selective representation in verbal form is akin to how sculptors or painters might emphasize certain features over others to capture the essence of their subject, just as a sculpture might detail the hands of a figure to show their skill or the strength of a character. The poet uses metaphorical language to highlight qualities like grace, power, or allure through the description of body parts. Thus, the Song of Songs provides a rich example of how the ancients integrated poetic language and artistic principles to create a vivid, holistic image of a person using only parts, illustrating a broader cultural understanding of human beauty and virtue. This integration shows a deep connection between language and material arts, where both are used to construct and convey similar concepts of the human form and its idealized traits. Parts of the body have functional meaning. The functional interpretation of body parts in both verbal and material depictions within the ancient Oriental and Old Testament context emphasizes that these interpretations serve specific purposes beyond mere visual or aesthetic appeal. This approach to understanding body parts is illustrated in various cultural artifacts where certain parts, such as hands, are depicted not for their physical likeness, but for their symbolic or functional significance. For instance, the depiction of a hand from Khirbet el-Khom is not just an artistic rendering. It serves a specific purpose, symbolizing protection. Scholars like Schroer and Mittman agree on its apotropaic function, which means its aversion to evil, indicating that the hand symbolizes God's protective presence. This interpretation aligns with how verbal depictions in text, like the Old Testament, also emphasize the functional aspect of body parts, such as hands conveying action or divine intervention rather than focusing solely on the physical form of a hand. This symbolic use of body parts in art resembles the use of language in speech acts, where the intent and effect of spoken words are central. Similarly, in what can be termed pictorial acts, the imagery intentionally invokes a function or response, performing much like verbal declarations or commands. These representations are not merely descriptive, but are performative, crafted to evoke or command presence, protection, or other concepts tied to cultural beliefs and practices. Thus, understanding these depictions requires a focus on the contextual and functional significance of the body parts, recognizing them as a form of communication that conveys deeper meanings within the cultural and historical settings of the ancient Near East. You can see why some try to use these symbolic functions as theological ways to hide God's body, because without that first-hand original context culturally, visually, symbolically, you won't be able to really understand this in depth. This is why we took the trail we did, explaining pictorial linguistic connections and material connections, trying to get a better grasp of how the ancients used the functionality of body parts, the visuals of body parts, and how they served more than just the literal function of their appearance. But the symbolic would not work without the actual underlying body being a present existent thing. Khirbet el-Qom is an archaeological site west of Hebron in the Judean hills. The 2 tombs that were found there were researched by archaeologist William G. Dever in 1967. This inscription is dated to the mid-8th century BCE. Scholars have been able to decipher most of the inscription on the tomb. The translation is on the screen. Yahu, the chief ruler, writing, "Bless Yahu by Yahweh, and from his enemies rivals by Asherah, deliverance by her." I guess there's indecipherable text, by Anyahu, by Astarah, and by Asherah. But while most stress the blessing and deliverance by Yahweh, negating the application of Asherah in the process, you will see that the hand is representative of the blessing of Asherah. The anthropomorphized understanding remains the same, but let's take a quick joyride into this evolution. First, let's look at the association of Tanit with Asherah. Tanit was the Phoenician, Carthaginian, from 814 BCE to 146 BCE, name of this goddess. She is a later version of the mother goddess Athirath, Ashratu, Asherah, with ties to Athene. That makes me wonder, as a non-expert, Athena? Could there be connections to the Greek here? And Anath. She was the consort to Baal Hamon, having the epithet Pnei Baal, face of Baal. Her symbol is a circle inside a crescent, supported by a triangle. The images in question bear a resemblance to depictions of Asherah, characterized by symbols of fertility, such as flora and fauna. These were found among amulets in Ashkelon, historically a Philistine city. An article by Steger discusses an ivory plaque from the Phoenician city of Sarepta, dating to the 7th century BCE, featuring the name Tanit Ashtart. This small relic, discovered by Professor James Pritchard, measures merely 2 inches by 1.3 inches and bears an inscription possibly linking it to a statue. This text memorializes the dedication of the statue to Tanit Ashtart by SLM, son of MPL, son of ZY. William Dever, in his book, Did God Have a Wife?, notes that doves, which often symbolize Asherah, are similarly associated with Tanit, indicating a cultural and religious connection between these figures in the histories of Israel and Judah. Mark Smith's Early History of God further explores this linkage, citing several ancient texts from Lebanon that refer to Tanit as the face of Baal, reflecting her significant role in regional religious contexts. These sources collectively highlight the intertwined nature of mythological figures across different cultures and epochs in the ancient Mediterranean. Here are a few more images of Tanit worthy of recognition, since we are recognizing overlap between Asherah and Tanit here. There's a stela with the engraved symbol of the goddess Tanit. Many of the funeral stela discovered at Carthage portray Tanit with this type of symbolism. Above is Tanit and the crescent moon symbol, representative of her consort Baal Hamon. We know in the Bible what's really interesting is the competition between Yahweh and Baal. And if we look at the earlier Ugaritic 13th century information we've discovered through tablets, this is something that was emphasized by Francesca Stavragopoulou. El is this supreme god ruling on a throne, kind of in retirement. Baal, the storm warrior deity, he ran things for his father El. Well, here you have Yahweh competing in Elijah mythology over against Yahweh and Baal, with these worshippers almost competing for who's going to run things. And of course, Yahweh wins out with this particular Yahwist propaganda in the Bible. But the fact that these characters that are outside of the Bible, all throughout the region, show up within the Bible, not only is it fascinating historically to evaluate these observations, but anyone who wants to isolate drawing the conclusion that is just told from the Bible without opening their brains to see and understand the conflict and the battle going on between various cults are missing what I would say are the best fun moments in these discoveries and how these gods are competing for who is going to win out. The fact that the inscription with the hand at the beginning even has Yahweh and Asherah's name together tells you there were cultists that were actually worshiping both and hope for the protection of both in the same context. So we will be doing a follow-up on the wife of God, Asherah, and doing a historical deep dive because this is too fascinating. A further evolution in the symbolism associated with Tanit is seen in the open hand of blessing, which also serves a protective function. This development is supported by various stela discovered in Carthage. Over time, this symbol of the open hand became increasingly significant, particularly within the religious traditions of Judaism and Islam, where it evolved to hold a prominent place as a symbol of both blessing and protection. We could see some of the art here, really amazing pieces that we found. And then another image with the fragment of a stela with the symbol of the goddess Tanit and other emblems from Carthage in its limestone. Really cool. The hand on the left, you've got the crescent moon symbol above her head. Kind of makes me wonder this crescent moon thing, how common and prevalent it is that among different cults, different religions. And we find that as a very important symbol in Islam. Also another one here with two doves and then the hand symbol at the top. You could see the goddess at the bottom here. So in Jewish tradition, the symbol of the protective blessing hand is known as the Hamesh. In Islamic culture, it is referred to as the hand of Fatima or Hamza, which means 5 in Arabic, symbolizing the 5 fingers and thumb. These amulets, which feature hand symbols, are prevalent in both Judaism and Islam, often used to ward off the evil eye. Today, people wear crosses and other types of symbols on their bodies, hoping that it would give them luck. You might see someone with a rabbit foot, thinking that this is magic or some type of luck will come. In the ancient world, they were huge on magic, magical principles, magical ways in which they can ward off evil from entering their life, ward off diseases, help them with crops, whatever their options were. We've heard the phrase blood magic. The idea of sacrifices is to magically, in some ways, enrich your own life to help you in some way that was beneficial. And this is ubiquitous in the entire world. You could see it in South American Mayan sacrifices of humans, even in the Middle East with sacrifices of animals and earlier humans, which we could go to Carthage or Phoenicia and see that they were doing this. We have ancient sources. Magic was important, and the evil eye was also a very powerful thing discussed by Francesca Stavrakopoulou in her book, God and Anatomy. The Encyclopedia Judaica notes that hand symbols on amulets, particularly those made of silver and originating from North Africa, are common. These symbols are believed to provide protection against the evil eye. While some attribute the hand of Fatima to the daughter of Muhammad, the use of hand symbols in North African amulets predates Islam by over 1,000 years, tracing back to Carthaginian times. Today, the tradition remains strong in regions like Morocco, Tunisia, and Algeria, as well as across the Muslim world. The Talmud describes a specific gesture to avert the evil eye, placing the right thumb in the left hand and the left thumb in the right hand, while declaring one's lineage from Joseph. This practice underscores the enduring belief in the evil eye among Eastern European Jews and many Oriental Jewish communities. In contemporary times, the use of blue paint and metal amulets shaped like an open palm continues to be a widespread thing among these communities. As the symbolism of the hand evolved in both Jewish and Islamic cultures, an additional feature often incorporated was an eye placed in the center of the hand. This modification enhances the amulet's protective qualities, specifically targeting the evil eye, a malevolent gaze believed to bring bad luck or harm to the person that it's directed at. Considering that Tanit has a connection with Asherah, A hand of blessing or protection, deliverance, occurs at the same time to the Elkom inscription. Some say the hand should be connected to the Asherah in that inscription originally shown, which had Yahweh and Asherah's name. We will be jumping back on track to God's body, but before we do, we just want to point out the striking correlation between the human body and the God's body in the language. This is important as we turn to God's body. God's hands. Dr. Wagner says it really well. Just as the human hand can take formative action, so can God's hands. God's formative action can, however, reach as far as forming the whole of creation. The creation is the work of his hands, Psalm 19:2, Isaiah 45:12. I made the earth and created mankind upon it. I, both my hands, spread out the heavens. The earth remains in the hands power of God, Exodus 15:12. As you stretched out your right hand, it swallowed the earth. God's hand is found, as is God's arms, in phrases about leading Israel out of Egypt. The phrase, with mighty hand and outstretched arm, is found in Deuteronomy all over the place, and in texts based on Deuteronomy, Jeremiah, Psalms. They all refer to the Exodus, Jeremiah 32:21. And you, Yahweh, brought your people Israel out of Egypt with signs and wonders by a mighty hand and outstretched arm, and with great terror. Psalm 136:12 is similar. Beyond this particular phrase, God's hand can be found acting alone without being combined with his arm. For example, Yahweh's great saving deed in Exodus 15:4, Pharaoh's chariot and his power he had hurled into the sea. Your right hand, Yahweh, has done great wonders. Your right hand has shattered the enemy. This use of God's hand ties in with the theme of creation. God's hand bestowed exceptional power on the prophets, 1 Kings 18:46, or made great knowledge available to them, Isaiah 8:11, Ezekiel 3:14. God's hand can express protection, for example, when it rests on the mountain Zion, as in Isaiah 25:10. It can also enclose, as an enemy force enclosed a town, Psalm 139:5. Those who recognize God's hand or power know God and receive a revelation, Deuteronomy 3:24. You, Yahweh, you have begun to reveal your greatness and your strong hand to your servant. For what God is there in heaven and on earth who can do the deeds and mighty works you do? Texts like this do not aim at a visual perception of God's hand, but at a perception of his acting in the world, his deeds for mankind, his power in the world. God's hands express functional meaning very similar to human hands. We have 218 examples of the hand in anthropomorphism. The hand is the most frequent instrument for God's deeds. However, the manner in which God's hands act in the Old Testament is fundamentally different to that of the humans, for it goes far beyond the possibilities open to people. Of course, he's God. God's power is more or less almighty in late texts such as Psalms 139. In the post-biblical Hellenistic context, we find a pictorial representation of God's hands in a fresco from a synagogue in Dura Europos in around 250 CE. Despite the fact that we never hear of God's left hand in the Old Testament, we see both hands here. Psalm 119:73, both, your hands have made me. Since this is certainly not a cult image, an image of this sort is evidently possible in a more liberal interpretation of the prohibition of imagery. Early Christendom was of the same opinion. God's feet. The Ark of the Covenant, as mentioned in 1 Chronicles 28:2, serves as a footstool under God's feet. symbolizing its subjection to Yahweh's dominion. Similarly, Psalm 132:7 invites the faithful to worship at God's footstool, which is indicative of his dwelling place. 1 Chronicles 28:2, I had intended to build a permanent home for the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord, for the footstool of our God. Psalm 132:7, let us go to his dwelling place. Let us worship at his footstool. The theme of subjugation extends further in text that describes Zion itself as God's footstool, indicating the total submission of this sacred space to divine rule. Lamentations 2:1, how the Lord has covered the daughter of Zion with the cloud of his anger. He has hurled down the splendor of Israel from heaven to earth. He has not remembered his footstool in the day of his anger. Psalm 99:5, exalt the Lord our God and worship at his footstool. He is holy. Isaiah 66:1 expands this concept to cosmic scale, asserting that the entire earth is God's footstool. Isaiah 66:1, this is what the Lord says, heaven is my throne, and the earth is my footstool. Where is the house you will build for me? Where will my resting place be? These passages collectively underscore the omnipotence of Yahweh, suggesting that nothing on earth can escape his dominion. This idea is echoed throughout the Old Testament, even during the Exile era, challenging earlier scholarly perspectives that viewed biblical anthropomorphism as antiquated. Furthermore, Ezekiel 43:7 emphasizes not only God's power, but also his tangible presence among the Israelites, linking the anthropomorphic imagery to divine immanence. Ezekiel 43:7, he said to me, Son of man, this is the place of my throne, and the place of the soles of my feet. This is where I will live among the Israelites forever. This interpretation finds a parallel in ancient Near Eastern culture, as demonstrated by the Temple of Ain-Dara in Syria, where large footprints carved into the threshold from the 9th-8th century BCE suggest a similar symbolic representation of a deity's presence and power. This same footprint is what inspired Dr. Stavrakopoulou's book cover. These biblical texts, rich with anthropomorphic imagery, offer profound insights into the evolving understanding of the divine character, emphasizing both the extreme power and the palpable presence of God within the community of his believers, and his real presence was as real to them as their real presence is to each other. This activity by the god or gods is not unique to the biblical God. It is described by all other ancient Near Eastern deities and depicted in stone at Ain-Dara. If we applied the same theologizing to these other deities, then we would come up with ways to try making them only into metaphysical beings with corporeal reality. Another way to put it, if God doesn't have actual feet to these ancients, God would have been dead to them. Later on, people found ways to think out of the very real expectation of these gods having bodies. God's arms. The functional meaning of human arms provide a vital context for understanding biblical references to the arms of God, treating them as real and active forces in the world. This conception enhances our appreciation of the scriptures that speak of God's arm as a direct expression of his power and protection. In the Hebrew Bible, God's arm is particularly significant in safeguarding and delivering the Israelites. The phrase, with a mighty hand and outstretched arm, repeatedly appears in Deuteronomy, and referenced in later texts, Jeremiah 32:21, Psalm 136:12. These references highlight God's intervention during the Exodus, notably described in Jeremiah 32:21. And you, Yahweh, brought your people Israel out of Egypt with signs and wonders, by a mighty hand and an outstretched arm, and with great terror. Additionally, God's arm is depicted as actively combating the forces of chaos. For example, Psalm 89:10 illustrates this action. You crushed Rahab, one of the chaos dragons, like one of the slain with your strong arm. This theme extends to the acts of creation and governance, portraying God's arm as an agent of both creation and ongoing governance, which maintains order and life. God's role as a divine warrior is also underscored by reference to his arm, with verses such as Exodus 15:16 and Psalm 79:11, 89:11, 89:14, highlighting his might in battle. This portrays Yahweh as a warrior deity, a concept that traces back to the earliest worship practices and continues into later eras. Furthermore, the arm of Yahweh is necessary for enforcing justice. As stated in Isaiah 51:5, it's sometimes addressed as if it were a person, emphasizing its active role. As in Isaiah 51:9, awake, clothe yourself with strength, you arm of Yahweh. Revealing his arm helps make God comprehensible to foreign peoples, as suggested in Isaiah 52:10. In a more pastoral role, God's arm is likened to a shepherd gathering his flock, illustrated in Isaiah 40, verse 11. He tends his flock like a shepherd. He gathers the lambs in his arms and carries them close to his heart. This nurturing gesture contrasts with his martial and creative functions. Collectively, these depictions of God's arms illustrate his active involvement and dynamic presence in the world, akin to the real and functional roles of human arms. This perspective underscores God's extensive capabilities that far surpass those of humans, embracing protection, creation, justice, and revelation. Another way to put it, if these portrayals were all just metaphors, and God was just a concept or abstract entity with no real body, then it's an odd way to constantly depict this deity, especially when these same concepts are used for all other gods of the ancient Near East. In Hebrew, the expression of power and mighty deeds often utilizes verbs that focus on the specific functions of the arm, hand, and foot. This linguistic approach personalizes the concept of power and sovereignty, suggesting a close relationship between power and powerful persons, implying that power cannot exist in the absence of a powerful agent. This perspective is not limited to human societal structures, but extends to our understanding of the divine power, particularly the might and actions of God. For instance, the functions attributed to different parts of the body in biblical language are as follows. The right hand and hands are generally associated with performing deeds. The arm is involved in action, emphasizing the execution of deeds. The foot symbolizes not only action, but also power and presence. Scriptural references to God's hands, arms, and feet highlight his active role in the world and his continual interventions on behalf of humanity. Thus, it is logical to conceive of God in a bodily form. How else could he act in the human realm if not through some form of physical agency? God's face. In Hebrew, the portrayal of divine power often involves vivid descriptions that employ physical features, such as the face, panim, to convey expression and communication. This is notably apparent in biblical proverbs, such as in Proverbs 16:15, which states, "When a king's face, panim, brightens, it means life. His favor is like a spring rain cloud." The king's mood and favor are visibly manifested in his countenance, underscoring the link between his facial expressions and his benevolent or wrathful dispositions. This use of panim to depict communication is extended to divine interactions, illustrating how God's face conveys his intentions and emotions. For example, the benevolent aspect of God's face is highlighted in blessings and prayers for divine favor. Number 6, 24 through 26, articulates a blessing that invokes God's luminous face for grace and peace, bright light of God. Psalm 67:1 and 80, verse 3 and 19, repeatedly call for God to make his face shine upon his people, associating his visible approval with salvation and favor. Conversely, the absence or aversion of God's face signifies disfavor or judgment, as illustrated in 1 Kings 21:4 and Jeremiah 21, where God's turned face foreshadows doom. The frequent biblical invocation to seek his face, Psalm 27:8, emphasizes a direct personal relationship with God, suggesting an individual's pursuit of divine presence and guidance. This is contrasted with broader calls for communal or general seeking of God, as seen in Amos 5:4, which lacks the intimate connotation of seeking God's face. Think, why seek God's face if they didn't believe God had a face? Is it really metaphors all the way down? The use of panim in scriptures often replaces pronouns or nouns, pointing to a dynamic interaction rather than a static presence. For example, Psalms 100 verse 2 encourages worship before his countenance with gladness, highlighting an expectation of communicative response from God, unlike references that might simply acknowledge his majesty or authority. Thus, the functional use of panim in biblical texts not only enriches the depiction of God, but also emphasizes the potential for communicative and relational dynamics between the divine and humanity. This use of corporeal imagery serves to convey complex theological concepts of God's active engagement and responsiveness, making the divine more accessible and relatable through the familiar lens of human expression and interaction. God's eyes. Eyes serve as a vital instrument for absorbing information and facilitating communication, a concept that extends even to the depiction of God in biblical texts. This notion is poignantly expressed in Psalm 94:9, which rhetorically asks, "Does he who implanted the ear not hear? Does he who formed the eye not see?" This verse underscores the belief that the Creator, who fashioned the organs of sense, is all-perceiving and all-hearing, further illustrating the communicative function of God's eyes. Psalms 34:15 states, "The eyes of the Lord are on the righteous, and his ears are attentive to their cry." This parallelism between God's eyes and ears emphasizes his attentiveness and responsiveness to human needs. The motif of divine observation also encompasses the idea of testing and examination, as seen in Psalm 139. This psalm describes God's omniscient gaze, which penetrates the most intimate aspects of human existence. "My frame was not hidden from you when I was made in the secret place, when I was woven together in the depths of the earth. Your eyes saw my unformed body. All the days ordained for me were written in your book before one of them came to be." This suggests not only God's awareness, but also his foreknowledge and planning for each life. Additionally, God's vigilant oversight is portrayed as protective, as in Ezra 5:5, where it is stated, "But the eye of their God was watching over the elders of the Jews, so that they were not stopped until a report could go to Darius and his written reply be received." Similarly, Psalms 33:18 declares, "But the eyes of the Lord are on those who fear him, on those whose hope is in his unfailing love," linking divine surveillance with safeguarding and favor. The concept of a deity endowed with multiple eyes, as found in some ancient Egyptian representations, symbolizes a capacity to see everything simultaneously, a visual metaphor for omniscience. Unlike these depictions, Old Testament anthropomorphism typically does not attribute God with many eyes, but rather portrays him with human-like features that suggest an enhanced form of vision. This depiction fosters a sense of familiarity and relatability, allowing believers to view God as a discernible and approachable entity. Yet his superior vision denotes the profound gulf between divine and human capabilities. This balance maintains God's transcendence while affirming his intimate involvement in the world. God's ears. The concept of divine hearing and its implications for communication between God and humanity is a recurrent theme in the Old Testament. This motif underscores the belief that God is actively listening to human supplications, a notion vividly illustrated through various scriptures. Numbers 11:18. Consecrate yourselves for tomorrow, and you shall eat meat, for you have wept in the hearing of the Lord, saying, who will give us meat to eat? For it was well with us in Egypt. Therefore the Lord will give you meat, and you shall eat. Psalm 10:17. O Lord, you hear the desire of the afflicted. You will strengthen their heart. You will incline your ear. Psalms 116:2. Because he inclined his ear to me, therefore I will call on him as long as I live. These passages suggest that God is not only a passive observer, but actively engages by listening to the cries and prayers of his people. For example, Psalms 116:2 reflects the personal assurance that God hears individual prayers, facilitating a direct line of communication. Further, Psalms 92:11 expands on this theme. My eyes have seen the downfall of my enemies. My ears have heard the doom of my evil assailants. This indicates that God's awareness extends beyond direct appeals. He is cognizant of all earthly events. The responsiveness of God to the cries of the afflicted is emphasized in verses like Psalm 10:17-18, where the pleas of the destitute are particularly heightened. This responsive aspect of divine hearing suggests that hearing is synonymous with answering. Archaeological findings contribute to our understanding of this motif. For instance, steles depicting the ears of the deity Amun-Re symbolize the divine reception of prayers. These artifacts, such as the limestone stele from Thebes, illustrate worshippers like Bai depicted kneeling before Amun, who is represented as a ram, indicating his readiness to receive and respond to human petitions. This imagery reinforces the theological concept that the divine senses, ears, eyes, and face are not just passive features, but active channels through which God engages with humanity. The abundance of divine ears in some artworks underscores the deity's omnipresent ability to hear and respond to multiple or a multitude of supplications simultaneously. Thus, in the biblical context, the act of hearing by God is an active, dynamic engagement that affirms his ongoing involvement in the world and his responsive relationship with humanity. These other worshippers believed their gods were listening with real ears on their bodies. But are we to believe Yahweh doesn't have ears in the minds of the ancient Israelites? Check out this crenellated model tower depicting God Ptah holding what was a scepter before an offering table. Women in adoration before ears on the other side. It's an 18th dynasty from Egypt, the Petrie Museum of Egyptian Archaeology. They were depicted to various deities, such as Ptah, Hathor, or Amun-Re, who were also defined as he, she, who listens to prayers. They believed the deities were real, had bodies, and actually could hear to listen to the prayers and supplications. Again, I ask the question, so does Yahweh have ears and listen to the prayers of his worshippers? At least in the minds of the believers, he does. God's nose. God often includes anthropomorphic features such as the nose, which is directly associated with the expression of divine wrath, like in Genesis 8:21. The Lord smelled the pleasing aroma, and said in his heart, "Never again will I curse the ground because of humans, even though every inclination of the heart is evil from childhood, and never again will I destroy all living creatures as I have done." Are we to pretend that Yahweh didn't smell the burnt offering in the minds of these authors? Fun fact, the earlier myths that the Bible clearly is influenced by show the gods and Enlil as smelling the aroma of Utnapishtim's sacrifice after the flood, and the smell softening Enlil's heart because he was hungry. This was understood in a very real sense. This physical attribute of God is not merely symbolic, but is described in a manner that attributes human-like qualities to the divine. In this verse above from Genesis, the reference to God's nose is explicitly linked to expressions of anger and fury, illustrating the direct and potent response of God to human actions. The use of the nose to signify anger emphasizes that God possesses physical features and experiences emotional responses similar to humans. The focus on God's nose, particularly in the context of divine wrath, contrasts with other bodily references that may denote more benign or nurturing aspects of God's relationship with humanity. The Old Testament frequently portrays God's wrath as a reaction to disobedience or sin, suggesting a dynamic and responsive relationship between the divine and human realms. Additionally, the impact of God's wrath is significant themes in Scripture, and it's demonstrated in the plea for mercy found in Psalm 85:5. Will you be angry with us forever? Will you prolong your anger through all generations? This verse conveys the deep concern and fear among humans regarding the enduring nature of God's anger. It's a human-like emotion, reflecting the serious consequences of divine displeasure. Through these descriptions, the Old Testament portrays God as possessing a real, human-like nose, which functions as a critical medium for expressing his judicial and emotional reactions to human behavior. This anthropomorphic portrayal helps to convey the intensity of God's interactions with humanity and underscores the moral expectations God has for his people. God's mouth. The mouth of God is depicted as an essential instrument for divine communication, enabling God to interact with and command the natural and human worlds. This concept is vividly illustrated in several biblical passages that highlight the unique and powerful nature of God's speech. Isaiah 55:11, "So is my word that goes out from my mouth. It will not return to me empty, but will accomplish what I desire and achieve the purpose for which I sent it." This verse emphasizes the efficacy and potency of God's word, differentiating it significantly from human speech. Unlike human words, which might fail to achieve their intended effects, every word that God speaks is purposeful and successful in fulfilling its intended outcome, or at least the author thinks so, though we have references in the mouth of Yahweh that fail, and this is where apocalypticism and other claims kind of falsify some of the ideas of the biblical God. But Proverbs 8:29 says, "When he gave the sea its boundaries, so that the waters would not overstep his command, and when he marked out the foundations of the earth." Here, the mouth of God, through his command, establishes the fundamental order of creation. The divine word set boundaries for the sea, a symbol of chaos, and outlines the earth's foundations. This passage underscores that God's commands are authoritative over all creation, not just humanity. The portrayal of God's mouth in these scriptures points to a profound ability to speak and enact change through language, a capacity that belongs solely to the divine. God's spoken word is not merely instructive, but performative, affecting what it declares and maintaining order within the cosmos. Thus, God's mouth is more than a feature. It is a testament to his sovereign power and active participation in the world he governs. The person in the back raises their hand and says, See, the biblical God is the only deity that by his word he creates and has power just by speaking. Well, I'm glad you made this statement, so I can quote Dr. Frederick L. Moriarty from Boston College, who wrote a paper called Word as Power in the Ancient Near East. The Bible no longer stands alone as witness to this concept. In fact, the Old Testament inherited with only slight modifications this dynamistic notion of the efficacious word, applying it according to its own theological needs and within the limits of its orthodoxy. Hypostatization of the divine word, for example, played little or no part in the Old Testament. Whatever may have been its extraordinary development in the New Testament, it seems that at the very beginning, a magical significance was attached to the word in the ancient world. Pronounced under the right circumstances, this word was thought to have irresistible power for good or evil. Studies in comparative religion provide countless examples of the word conceived as a magical power by which men could gain some control over their precarious environment. The spells, rituals, and execrations were so many techniques by which results were achieved. We, who make an essential distinction between an action and a formula, rite, or symbolic act, find it hard to understand the mentality of people for whom such distinctions had little or no meaning, since symbol and reality coalesced. When the gods of Mesopotamia had conferred kingship upon one of their number, Marduk, they wanted assurance that Marduk's word really had that magical power which brought results. They devised a test. They placed a garment in their midst and said to Marduk, their firstborn, "O Lord, thy lot is truly highest among the gods. Command annihilation and existence, and may both come true. May thy spoken word destroy the garments, then speak again and make it to be intact." He spoke, and at his word the garment was destroyed. He spoke again. The garment reappeared. The gods, his fathers, seeing the power of his word, rejoiced, paid homage. Marduk is king. In Sumerian culture, the basis of Mesopotamian civilization, the dogma of the divine word as creative power became firmly established. All that the creating deity had to do, according to this doctrine, was to lay his plans, utter the word, and pronounce the name. This notion of the creative power of the divine word was probably also the result of an analogical inference based on observation of human society. If a human king could achieve almost all he wanted by command, by no more than what seemed to be the words of his mouth, how much more was possible for the immortal and superhuman deities in charge of the four realms of the universe? But perhaps this easy solution of the cosmological problems, in which thought and word alone are so important, is largely a reflection of the drive to escape into hopeful wish fulfillment characteristic of practically all humans in times of stress and misfortune. A bilingual text, Sumerian and Akkadian, containing a hymn to the moon god Nana, celebrates the power of his word. Thou, when thy word is pronounced in heaven, the Agigi prostrate themselves. Thou, when thy word is pronounced on earth, the Anunnaki kiss the ground. Thou, when thy word drifts along in heaven like the wind, it makes rich the feeding and drinking of the land. Thou, when thy word settles down on the earth, green vegetation is produced. Thou, thy word makes fat the sheepfold and the stall. It makes living creatures widespread. Thou, thy word causes truth and justice to be, so that the people speak the truth. Thou, thy word which is far away in heaven, which is hidden in the earth, is something no one sees. Thou, who can comprehend thy word? Who can equal it, O Lord, in heaven as to dominion, on earth as to valor among the gods, thy brothers? Thou hast not a rival. A text from Babylonian records in the library of J. Piermont Morgan explicitly associates the word of power with the phenomena of nature. The storm is the word of Anu. The storm is the word of Enlil. The storm is the wrath of the great Anu. A somewhat more sophisticated notion of the word as something conceived underlies a difficult passage in the Sumerian exaltation of Inanna. Enheduanna, princess of priestess and poetess, seems to describe her magnificent creative effort in this hymn to the goddess as something to which she gave birth. The word of this hymn was conceived by Enheduanna, God's throat, neck, life. The Hebrew word nephesh, commonly translated as soul or life in English, carries complex and layered meanings that can vary significantly based on its biblical context. This richness of meaning presents a challenge in precisely defining the term, especially when referring to the divine nature of God. In Jeremiah 6 verse 8, we encounter the term in a particularly intriguing usage: reform, Jerusalem, before my nephesh turns from you, and I make you a desolate land in which no one can live. Here, nephesh can be interpreted as referring to God's deeply personal and intentional aspect, his will or purpose towards Jerusalem. The passage suggests a turning point contingent upon the city's response to divine admonition, highlighting the active and intentional characteristic of God's nephesh. It's not merely about the emotion or disposition, but about a decisive aspect of God's being that can turn towards or away from the people, indicating a form of relationship that involves presence, attention, and intention. The notion that nephesh encompasses the self in its most intense form of intentionality is pivotal. For God, nephesh implies vitality and consciousness, attributes that are essential to life and existence, much like they are for humans. This similarity between divine and human nephesh underlines a shared foundation for action and interaction, suggesting a common ground in the way both entities exist, act, and relate. Sure, we can find differences from the surrounding cults from the region to that of the biblical text as we now have them. The Israelite God is the only one, not many gods, though we see textual fossils of polytheism, and the clear earlier cults practiced polytheism. Is this a sign that the later authors are being influenced by Persian or Greek thinkers getting away from depicting their God? We also notice the gods have wives, and we know from findings in the region, El and Yahweh were seen to have a wife, Asherah, though the biblical authors want to scrub her from the record. While the later scribes did some editorial work, they never scrubbed God's physical body from existence. As far as the biblical portrayal is concerned, every time you find God depicted, you see these clear linguistic signals that the deity is having a body, even if he decides, based on author's perception, to hide it from people's views. The theological portrayal of God's body in the Old Testament is nuanced accomplishment that balances the anthropomorphic depiction of God with the rigorous monotheism characteristic of Israelite religion. This depiction allows for the retention of a mental image of God, despite strict prohibitions against physical representations, such as statues. The portrayal of God using human forms not only makes the divine concept accessible, but also underscores God's transcendent omnipotence, highlighting the unique theological perspective of the Old Testament. This sophisticated portrayal is the outcome of a lengthy theological evolution within the Israelite faith, marking various stages of development and understanding. The current understanding is just the beginning of a broader exploration into these developmental stages, transposing the Old Testament's anthropomorphic imagery of God directly into modern visual concepts without a reflective and interpretive process risks distorting these theological intentions. Such an unexamined transfer could lead to criticisms of making God too tangible or material, which would be a modern misreading of the original scriptural intent. To appreciate the Old Testament's approach to anthropomorphism fully, it is essential to recognize the historical and cultural context that shaped these portrayals. The biblical images of God were designed to maintain a balance, making God approachable, communicatable, and potent, while also ensuring that he remains inaccessible and wholly divine. This dual nature keeps God both immanent and transcendent, embodying a theology that holds God in human form as simultaneously near and far. It's clear that God has a body according to the biblical texts. What it is made of depends on the context, and when it appears to be physical material like humans, we have no clue exactly what it's made of. Other times it appears to be made of light, needing to be hidden by dark clouds. The Bible has so many voices, and not all are saying the same things. We have seen how Dr. Francesca Stavrakopoulou's work fits right in line with other scholars doing this kind of work. The reason she has caught attention by those defenders of God is that she talks about God functioning in sexual ways, including language of rape attributed to Yahweh. Of course, this will upset some who protect the image of their God, but was the absolute norm for all deities in the various regions, including the one from which the Judeans who put the final touches on this tradition were raised. I hope the tedious sections of trying to show ancient depictions of man in their own artistic fashion correlates to the linguistic depictions of men in the text inside and outside of the Bible. Well, this same language is used for humans as it is for the divinity of the Bible. The most natural conclusion is that this God also has a body. It's also worth noting these ancient cultures fused symbolic meaning into the mundane realities of the body. So you can have metaphor or euphemisms that represent body parts as agricultural or architectural or other phenomena known to the ancient audience from their period. We want to have a better grasp on what these texts mean when they say something. We need to go back in time and piece it together. In this, we showed two-dimensional and three-dimensional examples. We compared things that were cross-cultural and tried to bring this God back to life. He has truly been buried under millennia of philosophy, but with the right tools, we could still see his bones.